Hey, Heidi, am I ready to go? Okay. Well, good morning. Welcome back. Uh, this is a big day. This is Betty's 90th, and wait till you go downstairs. They've really done it up. And so, yeah, it's kind of like this is your life, Betty. And so it's really neat. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of folk that are coming in that normally aren't here, and others so that's exciting. Well, we are as we continue on in our study of our history of our churches of Christ. We are now moving into last time we're talking about the challenges that were going on, and that rough and tumble style Foy Wallace and Virginia came up to me afterwards and said that she was in a congregation with or had lunch with, worked with a cousin of Foy Wallace when she was in Texas. And then Ellen told me that she had a meal with his widow in Texas back in the early 80s, because he passed in 79. So I thought that was really interesting as they shared those things, and thank you for doing that. Well, as we said, that this idea of this resisting and that people gone soft is what was used, because they were Wallace and others were from Texas and had that real tough approach. And so they kind of viewed it in that very combative style of dealing with differences that people held, not only with other groups, but also within the fellowship. And so that style and way of doing things became very prominent. Well, as we continue on into the 30s, there were those that said, "Hey, wait a minute," and didn't agree with that approach. And there were those that were preaching a more grace-oriented approach rather than this "what you do" kind of approach. And so that's where we go now. Hold on here. Heidi, did you unfreeze me? You sure? I'm on. Oh, no, I was off. There we go. Okay. So apocalypticism, and we said that was this worldview that for our fellowship went back to Barton Stone and others, for those that are new here. And that was, this world is not our home, have nothing to do with the governments and the things. You just go on, keep your head down, you're a Christian, and so on and so forth. But that apocalyptic view often translated into a rich understanding of justification by grace through faith. And so they had a greater, those that kind of came from that end of the movement understood those things a little more. And so yet a few prominent leaders in our churches of Christ articulated a theme of grace as forthrightly as did R.H. Bull, who was a big understander of millennialism and premillennialism. Now, again, I'm sorry for going back, but for those that are newer here, the premillennialism that was going on in those times hadn't quite matured to the point of Hal Lindsey, and where locusts and gnats or attack helicopters from Russia and things like that happened in the 60s, and so on. And so this idea of premillennialism became looked upon as not good and as bad and as something very wrong. And yet Bull, because of this deep understanding of grace, is why he held his premillennial views. And so there were those like K.C. Mosier, who was a Texas preacher, and G.C. Brewer, who was more in Tennessee. They they understood that gracious outlook. Heidi? What is going on? There we go. But there were other leaders also rooted in the apocalyptic heritage who conceptualized grace in terms of tolerance for competing perspectives and a reverential search for truth. Their apocalypticism led them to affirm that God was God and stood in judgment on all human pretensions, and that only God and no human being had a corner on the market of truth. And so what we see here is we see those that are okay. If somebody thinks a little different, they're being a little more gracious because God has been gracious. And that was going against others that said, unless you believe this, what I'm telling you, you're not right and correct. And so that's that conflict, somewhat simplified, that is going on. But there were, what is going on here? Heidi, you keep turning me in and out? Okay, with the Stone Lipscomb tradition, this belief in a sovereign God who defies truth and himself is truth, often inspired a passionate search for truth and a tolerance that differed from their own. They viewed such tolerance as a form of grace embodied in common life. And so they're after truth. And that's one thing that it was very, very great about the history in our fellowship, was this desire to look to the Scriptures and study them diligently to find out what truth is. And so that was very strong. However, what happened is kind of it kind of diverged, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Heidi's doing work up there. Heidi? At the same time, the notion of a sovereign God inspired among those people a sense of judgment. And truth was truth and right was right, after all, especially since God himself made those determinations. Okay, so God is God, and God determines what truth is. The sense of divine sovereignty that inspired a search for truth thus also inspired a categorical rejection of compromise and error. And for this reason, the themes of judgment and grace often went together and stood in a dialectical tension within the Stone Lipscomb heritage well into our 20th century. Okay, so what is this? What are we saying here? We're saying that there's a desire to know truth, but then there is also the thought is if there's truth, there must be error. And so there's a right and there's a wrong. And so there are those that tended to gravitate more toward that idea of determining and pointing out what was wrong in the conclusions that people made different from their own. While there was others that, okay, they go, I don't agree with you, but they didn't take it to that extreme. And so, and again, this is what happens. And again, it wasn't just our fellowship. This is how people thought and how they operated. And so there's going to be this tension, this debate, if you will, between these kind of positions that continue to today. And it's happening today. Heidi? But this sense of debate and relationship between judgment and grace tended to dissolve in what he calls the acid bath of the premillennial controversy. And so in this debate, and again, we don't understand the intensity of what the premillennial controversy was within our fellowship. And in the 1920s and in the 1930s, it was, I don't know if it was the thing, but it was intense. that if you held these views, you're not right. And it was a tremendous battle. And that's why we've mentioned in here many times that when we looked in the O'Fallon Church of Christ bylaws that was started in 1961, 1950, right in that late 50s, early 60s, there's in our bylaws that said there can be no premillennial teaching. And so, to us sitting here, well, why'd they do that? Because we don't understand. Well, those that founded this congregation grew up in those times of when that was going on. And so that still resonated and was deeply embedded in them as to why that was in there. Just kind of an interesting kind of historical perspective. And so those in the Wallace camp increasingly focused on the judgment aspect, pointing out where others have gone astray, have gone in error, to the neglect of grace. And many on the Stone-Lipscomb tradition who opposed Wallace gravitated toward affirmations of grace rather than affirmations of judgment. And so you have in this time two different perspectives that are going to be developing. And frankly, the grace aspect or focus was not nearly as prominent or as strong at that time that it has become for many in our fellowship today. And so just realize things change over time. Heidi. This most singular preoccupation with grace, whether in its classic biblical form or in its more democratic social manifestation, brought striking changes to the Stone-Lipscomb tradition and to our entire fellowship. In the first place, I got a bad battery? Is that what you're telling me? Okay. In the first place, those who oppose Wallace by focusing on various aspects of grace subtly transformed the long-standing tradition of tolerance for differing viewpoints into a tradition of consensus. Okay, so this is a change is happening. And so what do we mean by consensus? Well, consensus is generally the idea that everybody kind of agrees. And so what happened is we're going to look at, and we're going to see how this happens, or what happened is that there were those that were focusing on things other than the more contentious issues, on values and different things like that. And so this is when we see that's happening. Given the highly polarized intellectual climate that prevailed in the 1930s, it was difficult to engender tolerance for differing perspectives or to air those differences civilly in the public arena. Under these circumstances, many settled on consensus as the best option. Now, in our tradition, as we're going to see, there was, from back as far as Campbell, there was this idea that you debate the issues. And so Ken thinks this on this, and Edwin thinks this on that. And so they would have their discussion, and many people would attend. You didn't have TV, you didn't have football events, you didn't have sports, you didn't have this. And so what do? You go to the debates, and you listen to what's being said. And so that happened. And that's what they did, and they thought fine about it. It was later that it became this: if you don't hold to this position, that you got issues. How did you find him? Oh my. Sorry about that. And so, second, in seeking to shape consensus, those who opposed Wallace increasingly sought to build that consensus around positive and constructive themes and to eliminate negative themes altogether. If Wallace called for hard negative preaching and writing, his opponents increasingly called for positive thinking, positive preaching, positive writing, and they often confused criticism with cynicism. Throughout the remainder of the century, this emphasis on positive thinking became a hallmark to the progressive leadership in churches of Christ. And so it's in this time we see this conscious change by those that were no longer wanting to go that route of the debates and the pointing out all these things. They go, let's focus on the positive things that are in the Scripture. And so there was others that didn't like it, and there's those that don't like it today. And so that was in the 20s and 30s. Third, in the context of their preoccupation with consensus built on positive thinking, those who opposed Wallace determined that theological issues germane to the Christian heritage often generated considerable controversy, whereas biblically rooted cultural values often generated the consensus that they taught. In other words, how should we live as a Christian rather than what do you think on this issue or that issue is what kind of became a focus. And so we see that in our fellowship. The last decades, there's been the congregations that have gone more focusing on those things. We got them in the right way, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't know. I think it stays on. Yeah. Sorry about that. Can't live with it. Can't live without it. The technology. And so again, this focus on cultural values was going to become more and more prominent. In the interest of harmony and consensus, they increasingly ignored the theological issues and again focused on these biblical rooted values that might best serve as a basis for unity and for peace. The practical value of providence and prayer, the values of family life, Christian unity, Christian business ethics, Christian education, kindness, goodness, basic morality, and the role of Christianity in promoting mental health. And so just a whole lot of these topics. And again, why was this? To seek unity and to seek peace, rather than the division that had developed and the fighting of who's camp and who's in what and so on and so forth. This affirmation of cultural values was not produced solely in reaction to doctrinal divisiveness of Wallace and his people. It was also associated with a heightened level of education and the growing sense of middle-class propriety that was rapidly gaining ground within our churches of Christ and the culture abroad. Virtually all who led in the effort to circumvent Wallace's program have been exposed to substantial higher education. Okay, now, what's going on here? As when we looked at what was going on in the culture here in the past, we have seen, this is the 1930s by now, that certainly since the Civil War, things had massively changed or was changing in the country. One of the things that was massively changing was the growth of the cities, was the rise of wages, that growing economy, and so on and so forth. And so, and again, I often hold the period from the Civil War up until, at least World War I is probably one of the lesser studied periods of our country, at least in my opinion. And there's a lot that went on that influenced these things that came later. And so we see in our culture, in the American culture, this massive change from the more agrarian, rural farmer, farmer that Thomas Jefferson talked about, to where people live in the cities. You've had the Industrial Revolution coming along. You have factories. You have all this. And so for many, people's incomes went up. And so it was in this period that we begin to see this rise of what we call the middle class, instead of just those that have and those that are just getting by. And so that changes perspectives on things. And so that's some of what is going on. And in that environment, that our environments influence how we look at and see Scripture and our understandings of that. And so we see that happening and this change going on into what people accept and think is good and so on and so forth. Well, one of those things is there were more and more were getting a higher education. Now, huge percentage? No, but more and more. And so, as we know, when we get an education, we're exposed to more things. Now, some would say that's really good, and it is. And of course, some also say that could be really bad, and that could be true too at the same time. You know, we see the things that were going on in New York and all the riots over Israel and so on and so forth. Well, a lot of that understanding on those that were, protesting, a lot of that were coming down from, and so, it can be both ways. That's very clear. But nonetheless, it changes how we view things. Partly because we become aware and we know more, and if we operate just in our own little bubble, our own little tight little circle, well, there's a lot we can miss, and that we're not aware of. And so that's what's going on in this time. And so some of this tension is a reaction because of that. Now, we have often tried to put that in theological narrative, but really a big chunk of it is this effect. And so it's important that we're aware of that. Several were college presidents, and others had either graduate degrees or were enrolled in graduate studies programs. This group of leaders self-consciously appealed to a relatively educated urban audience, whereas Wallace generally appealed to a less sophisticated audience that on the whole was suspicious of cities and of wealth and of education. Wallace found supporters in urban areas as well, but these were often people who were estranged from the city in many ways. And so we're seeing that social divide of the more rural areas, and it works? The light's on? Oh, that'll do it. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Sorry. Thank you, Heidi, saving us all here. And so, again, these factors in. The key point here is that many in the churches of Christ during the 1930s and 40s took a decisive turn toward what some have termed an acculturated faith that was grounded in grace, understood as tolerance along with middle-class American values. A faith largely divorced from that radical sense of God's judgment, and so have nothing to do with the world, that apocalyptical thinking that characterized much of our 19th century forebears. We have already noted this shift of emphasis on the part of George Benson, who we said was later was the president for a long time at Harding, and Clinton Davidson, who was very influential. We'll look at him again a little bit more in the mid-1930s. So in the late 1930s, the shift again appeared in two new journals, publications. Remember, in Churches of Christ especially, I'm sure everybody else, there was all the journals. And so, which one do you read? Well, I read this one, or I read that one. I wouldn't read that rag. We all do it with newspapers. Back when we had the Globe Democrat and the Post-Dispatch in St. Louis years ago. Now there's just one. But again, that thinking. And so they wanted to introduce two new journals. One was called The Christian Leader, which already had a history, and we're going to talk about that, and what was called 20th Century Christian. And most of us are more familiar with that because that was not only a magazine, but it was later a bookstore. And it was a bookstore that many got our Sunday school materials and all this other stuff. We ordered from that. That was a Church of Christ publishing wing or part of that. And so, my goodness. Before exploring these developments and the cultural shifts they represented, we should first consider the tradition of tolerance and free and open discussion in the interest of truth that prevailed within our Stone Lipscomb tradition. It was in this tradition that the progressives among Churches of Christ in the 1930s self-consciously based their opposition to Foy Wallace. So let's see what that is. The ongoing search for truth was central, as we said, to our tradition, as well as for Alexander Campbell. Though, as we've seen, many of those who took what Campbell was writing in the Christian Baptist and took it and ran with it, made it more than maybe he ever envisioned perspective, and lost sight of its meaning and significance. In the early years of the 19th century, most Campbellites and Stonites were united in their agreement on this point. And so there was agreement. Under the leadership of the influential Stonite turned Campbellite minister John Rogers, and we talked about him previously, the entire Church of Christ at Concord, Kentucky, affirmed in 1830 that the fatal error of all reformers has been that they have too hastily concluded that they knew the whole truth and have settled back upon the same principles of proscription, tolerance, and persecution against which they have so strongly remonstrated. Having then full in our view this fatal rock on which so many reformers have split, may we studiously avoid it. We have no reason to conclude we know all the truth, and we have nothing to lose in this inquiry after truth, and we have no system to bind us to human opinions. And so what he's recognizing, what a profound statement here, is he said, why is there reform? And if you look throughout church history, there's been periods of reform throughout, before the Reformation. And so there's always been periods throughout. And of course, why was that? Because there are those that came to the conclusion that things that were happening or being done or whatever weren't biblical, weren't right, weren't what they thought or understood God was wanting to teach. That things had gone awry. And so, but then what happened? So the reformers then work, and they get more and more people to, come to the understanding that they have and then agree with that, and then they come into power. And of course, what is he pointing out? That often then, and of course, those who are in power, what do they do to try to stop those that are trying to reform? They try to squash them by whatever means. Now, prior to the Reformation, and even during the Reformation, and some after the Reformation, what they did to those people, sometimes they burned them at the stake. So it wasn't just the Catholic Church trying to do that to the Protestants. The Protestants did it. Zwingli did it. Calvin did it. All those, the people that are doing different than what they, even though they were part of that same understanding before. And of course, so that's what Rogers is pointing out, that they often become the very thing which they were reforming against. Now, how does that happen? That certainly is not the reformers' intention when they start reforming. And it's probably because they forget or they aren't aware. Christiana, were you going to say something? Yeah. You're right. You mean gracious? A little more gracious? toward yeah. I mean totally. And so this is what's going on. And there were those that, I mean, obviously he was 1800s and realizing these things. And you know what? It's really easy to do that if we aren't aware of that. Well, as Carl Ketcherside said in his autobiography, it's about egos, and you know, we just need to, those things fit into stuff, and you know, some people can't handle it, that maybe their conclusion wasn't as right as they thought or pristine. And again, by saying right, I'm not trying to say it's right or it's wrong. I'm not meaning that necessarily, though there's some things that are right and wrong. I mean, if you say Jesus isn't the Son of God, well, there's not a whole lot of room there to wiggle or debate in. But interesting. Yes, and I suspect it will in the future, and I also suspect it's not unique to our fellowship. You know, and so I had I think I mentioned this at, no, well, I won't say that. Okay. Rogers, well, one was bad, but I don't want to say. Rogers represented both the Campbell and Stone sides of this movement in the early years. As went on, those who embraced the search for truth more strongly were those who had at least one foot squarely planted in the apocalyptical tradition inspired by Stone. In other words, he wasn't writing everybody off. Now, he felt very strongly. Don't think that people like Stone or whatever didn't have their strong views, because they did. But they were also being gracious in what they taught. David Lipscomb is perhaps the most notable case in point. When asked in 1875 about the question of excommunication, so there were those wanting to run people out in the rail, Lipscomb responded, "So long as a man desires to do right and to serve the Lord and to obey his commands, we cannot withdraw from him. We are willing to accept him as a brother no matter how ignorant he may be or how far short of the perfect standard of his life may fall from his ignorance. But what is needed is patient instruction and discipline in the church instead of withdrawal from the weak. Now, there's also some assumptions behind this statement, in that he's assuming he's right and the other guy isn't, but nonetheless. And so there was this tolerance among many in that time that ended up changing, because there were those that said, that can't be. That can't be. In 1907, he criticized preachers within our fellowship who spent their time to combat the sects, to expose their errors and show mistakes they make. He charged that among such people, this party zeal becomes a substitute for the love of truth and the practice of godliness. And so in the idea of we're trying to get truth out there, we're trying to weed out all the heretics. And of course, who's a heretic? Anybody that thought differently than me, than the person putting out those charges, rather than someone that disrupts and causes dissension, is what is more what a heretic is, and not somebody that thinks differently on a particular piece of understanding or doctrine in the Scripture per se. At the old National Bible School, Lipscomb routinely promoted debate and discussion on all sides of the controversial issue. Jesse P. Sewell recalled in 1940, when I was a student in the National Bible School, so remember, Sewell is one of the people at the school now, the teachers and so on, but when he was a student, he says, each year they brought Brother G.C. Taylor there, and I do not know who that is. He and Brother Lipscomb would debate the civil government question. And of course, we talked about Lipscomb's writings on civil government, and we went into that extensively. They brought in Brother T.W. Brents. He and my uncle, E.G. Sewell, would debate the laying on of hands question. The people who were allowed to hear the strongest that could be presented on both sides of these controverted issues. In other words, it was encouraged, the debate from the different points of view, or at least he was at that time. In his role as editor of the Gospel Advocate, Lipscomb assiduously practiced the policy of open journalism and routinely printed articles and opinions that differed from his own. He reserved the right to challenge his opinions and not to vanquish his writers, but to encourage dialogue and conversation in the ongoing search for truth. Wouldn't that be nice today in our political climate, instead of canceling out those that have a different view? F.D. Sirigley, who wearied in 1885 of what he called the Southern Journalism and Theology, now that appeared regularly in the Gospel Advocate. If you recall, because we touched on this, that the Gospel Advocate was started by Fanning and Lipscomb, because in the North you had the Christian Standard and you had others promoting that, and that was that sectional divide of North and South, and that figured into the things being said in our journals, okay? And so the Gospel Advocate was started by Lipscomb to present a Southern point of view. Now, that wasn't necessarily supporting slavery, but a Southern perspective. Sirigley disagreed with practically every position Lipscomb took, including those on participation in politics, on instrumental music, and on missionary societies. So remember, this is before the split, and I would assume Sirigley went with the disciples. And he went so far as to propose that a group of progressives buy stock in the Advocate, neutralize Lipscomb, and suppress the 6-for-a-nickel jackasses that are now braying in it. They were kind of colorful back then. 4 years later, in 1889, Lipscomb added the name of F.D. Sirigley to the Advocate staff. By 1892, with Sirigley still on staff, Lipscomb observed that Brother Sirigley feels under no obligation yet to agree with Brother Lipscomb. And of course, they often wrote in third person, is what Lipscomb's doing there. And so we see this, even though they loved the back and forth, they weren't. Not everybody was saying, "Hey, you're not my brother because you think differently." No wonder then when B.C. Goodpasture, and some of us have probably heard that name, sought in the 1940s sought to rebuke Fort E. Wallace for his hard and arrogant style, he simply reprinted an editorial from David Lipscomb. A true lover of truth seeks out and appropriates as his own every truth he finds, no matter who holds it or teaches it. And the love of truth is a spirit of kindness and love towards all, even to the holder of error. Wow. We could use a little bit of that now in our times. And so just very, very significant there. We will stop here as it is time. So I hope we're beginning to get a flavor of this back and forth that's going on, and this is that time when there was a transition going on, and a battle in those two different perspectives and ways of looking at things, which affected who we are today, among many other things, as we'll get to those. So thank you very much. Sorry for the